InvestorIdeas.com Podcasts.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of InvestorIdeas.com Podcasts. In today's podcast, I'll be looking at some of the major industry news highlights from last week as well as this week, including advertising on Twitter and the state of the Canadian cannabis industry. So if you didn't hear about it, but I'm sure you did if you're paying attention to the cannabis industry, one of the bigger pieces of news to come out for the industry was that Twitter announced earlier last week that it will be allowing approved and state legal cannabis companies and other advertisers to post ads in the U.S. for regulated THC and CBD products, accessories, and services. We permit approved cannabis, including CBD cannabinoids, advertisers to target the United States, providing a slew of conditions are met, Twitter said on its website under the heading Drugs and Drug Paraphernalia. AdCan, which is a cannabis marketing and advertising website based in Toronto, first reported the development in a social media post. Now, AdCan noted that effective immediately, Twitter will permit advertisers to promote brand preference and informational cannabis-related content for certain products and services, including CBD products, THC products, and cannabis-related products and services, including delivery services, labs, and events. American cannabis companies, brands, and purveyors will need to pass through a Twitter advertiser approval process to ensure they are legitimate and educated on the platform, AdCan reported. Now, under the new guidelines, Twitter said that the cannabis advertisers, presumably companies, will be subject to a variety of restrictions and conditions. The advertisers must be licensed by appropriate authorities and pre-authorized by Twitter. Advertisers may only target jurisdictions in which they are licensed to promote these products. Advertisers may not promote or offer the sale of cannabis. The exception would be ads for topicals or hemp-derived CBD topical products with less than 0.3% THC. Advertisers are responsible for complying with all applicable laws, rules, regulations, and advertising guidelines, and advertisers may not target consumers under the age of 21. So, pretty big step forward for the cannabis industry. As many people have already pointed out, cannabis was already a massive topic of discussion on Twitter, and a lot of people within the industry had already been using it in a variety of ways. Obviously no direct advertising, but it was kind of one of the main social media platforms that already was being used by the cannabis industry, so it does kind of make sense, as well as Elon Musk has had his own controversies with smoking weed on Joe Rogan's show and just being on board with the cannabis industry in general and psychedelics. So it does make sense in lots of ways that this is what's moving forward. In related news, TRUL Cannabis Corporation, trading on the CSE as TRUL and the OTCQX as TCNNF, became the first multi-state operator in the cannabis industry to launch an advertising campaign on Twitter. TRUL is very excited and encouraged by Twitter's decision to update its policies and allow cannabis companies to advertise across the platform, said Gina Collins, TRUL's chief marketing officer. Having a global social media platform recognize our industry as another step forward in the normalization of cannabis in the U.S. We proudly launched a multi-state advertising campaign to become the first company in the cannabis industry on Twitter, and as state-by-state cannabis regulations inform how operators can participate in the advertising space, we expect to follow in other legally approved states. Now, TRUL Chief Executive Officer Kim Rivers said on Twitter, on behalf of TRUL and the entire cannabis industry, thank you to Elon Musk for the historic policy change and partnership. The opportunity to advertise on Twitter means reaching more individuals and raising more awareness of the benefits of cannabis. Onward. So again, big step forward for the industry and actually having a social media platform adopt cannabis in some fashion. Again, there are still a variety of restrictions that are going to limit lots of companies and lots of people from really doing what they want to, but it's a big step in the right direction when you're looking at other social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, etc. Cannabis companies pretty much get banned on the daily, and lots of companies have still been pursuing those avenues of advertising and marketing and just creating new accounts, or they've had hired marketing teams that understand the restrictions a little better and have been able to avoid getting their account shut down right away. But in general, hopefully this will be a trend that other media platforms, not just social media platforms, but just media in general, will start to look at. Is realistically, there's not a logical reason why cannabis shouldn't be able to advertise when you consider the amount of pharmaceutical and alcohol ads that are out on the market, and those have much higher consequences and risks associated with them than cannabis ever will. And as well, for this industry to move forward, they have to be able to play on somewhat of an even footing with other aspects of other industries. And I do think that this is, like I said, probably one of the bigger steps forward for the industry as a whole. So I'm sure many people will be using Twitter much more aggressively within the cannabis space over the next while. It'll be interesting to see what kind of advertising we get. I think that the obvious loophole for a lot of people to look at is putting out educational content, which is still actually extremely necessary for just consumers in general. A lot of people don't really know that much about these products or what to look for. As much as we like to say that, some of these markets are more developed, like California, it's still very nascent. A lot of these people still really don't know a lot about cannabis and the industry as a whole. So I'd like to see, hopefully you can start to see a lot of videos explaining the grow techniques, explaining the whole process from start to finish, and showing you the finished product and why there are the benefits of it. I'd love to see more education on terpenes and sort of the different components of cannabis other than just THC content. So I do think that there's a lot of potential there, and hopefully, like I said, this will be the sort of step that attracts other companies and other media businesses to look at this industry and say, well, why don't we want to be a part of this as well? Because it is where things are heading. I guess you have to be a very naive or crazy person at this point to think that cannabis is going to go back in the bag and that we're going to have some sort of delegalization or recriminalization of cannabis in certain areas of the world. It just isn't going to go backwards. It's only going to go forwards. So it does seem strange to me that there's still so much hesitancy from the sort of business and financial world in many respects to wanting to participate in this, because it is an eventuality. It's not a matter of when, not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And hopefully, like I said, this will create enough attention and enough attraction. I know that Twitter in general has been getting a lot of weird stigma associated with it lately. There's lots of celebrities quitting Twitter in a very hilarious fashion. But I do think as well, for Twitter as a company, one of the things Elon Musk has mentioned is sort of a path to profitability, as the company is not really making any money. And so there is a lot of benefit for him pushing this for cannabis advertisers, which don't have other advertising options, so that way he can generate revenue, and also so these companies can gain more awareness. So it's kind of a win-win that, again, I really do hope will leak into other media empires of the world. Now, in other recent news, last week, 5 Canadian cannabis sector CEOs joined a press conference organized by the Cannabis Council of Canada on Parliament Hill to discuss the extent of layoffs and the facility closures in the industry. You're hearing from producers here today because we are growers and manufacturers sit at the heart of the cannabis supply chain, said President and CEO of British Columbia company Pure Sunfarms, Mandesh Dosanjh. We need to be healthy in order for the whole system to thrive, but that's not a reality. Producers stand here in peril, and Canadian cannabis is in peril. Now, high excise taxes have been one of the biggest challenges for the business, the CEO said in Wednesday's press conference, adding that 2.3% excise tax rate has become too costly, particularly after a year of increased inflation rates. Now, Jonathan Wilson, CEO of New Brunswick cannabis company Crystal Cure, called for the federal government to reconsider the tax rate, as he said it's not only pushing away current businesses, but eliminating the path for new producers to enter and grow the sector. It's not only a significant burden for producers like us, but it's the barrier for entry for new producers to come into the legal market, Wilson said. We're paying a regulatory fee which was premised on the profitable industry, with tobacco and alcohol don't pay, President of the Cannabis Council of Canada, George Smitherman, said. Now, a 2022 report found that the Canadian cannabis investing in cannabis businesses collectively lost more than $131 billion. Industry leaders said that they built their businesses on the federal government's promises for a profitable industry, but now the profits are shaking and they're hoping for immediate action. What happened to Smiths Falls? That's just report regarding Canopy Growth, who had their massive amounts of layoffs. But again, there's been a few other large-scale producers who have also had layoffs, Smiths Falls being the largest. I think they did over a couple hundred people. Most of them have been around 100. But can happen to any entity in Canada. CEO of TRUL Cannabis, Leonard Walter, said. There are federal and provincial regulations that both need to be worked on, and there are solutions, we just need folks talking. Now, after a nearly 12-month delay, Health Canada announced in September that it would be conducting a legislative review of the Cannabis Act. Smitherman said while there have been data collected and surveys created to increase awareness on the problems of the industry, he hopes it'll be enough to talk into consideration ahead of the 2023 budget. So, I don't think this is a big surprise for many people in the industry. Within that same report, and you can click the links attached in the article, and I definitely recommend going to the Cannabis Council of Canada website, where they have more of this information and some of the actual data charts they addressed in this meeting. But it's not a big surprise to anyone in the industry, and I just can't imagine that's a surprise to anyone with regards to government and regulations. They are well aware of what they're doing to the industry. They're well aware of the problems the industry is facing. They just don't seem to be motivated to change much of it. And this is kind of a problem not just in Canada, but industry-wide when you're looking at how, again, people treat the cannabis industry. California has some of the exact same issues. High taxation, which is slowly beating down a lot of these companies, which are doing everything that they're required to do. They've jumped through a lot of hoops to get their businesses operational. And now with inflation combined with extra taxes, a lot of these companies are struggling, if not downright failing. And I would say, take this with a little bit of skepticism in that it is large-scale producers who are mainly making this complaint. And a lot of them are based around public companies and having their stocks, available to the public. Those have been the companies that have lost the most amount of money. Those have been the companies that have had the biggest layoffs. Those have been the companies that have struggled the most. When you're looking at more small to medium-sized producers in Canada as well as in California, they are succeeding at a higher level. They are a little bit more efficient. They are a little bit more effective in running their business. They've done a little bit more logical and organic growth as opposed to getting a huge amount of funding and just shooting for the stars. I do think that these large-scale producers do have a legitimate complaint towards the Canadian government of basically both investors and the companies themselves were kind of promised an environment that didn't end up existing, which was, we saw, beverages were going to be a big thing. They've been heavily hampered by regulations. We thought that lots of things were going to explode in a very different way, but because of restrictions with THC, because of restrictions on how much you can buy of certain amounts of product, because of restrictions on packaging, because of restrictions on aging of the product, you've basically guaranteed that this industry would somewhat fail, especially compared to the black market, which we've seen in almost every market has thrived with legalization because the penalties are lower for running an illicit cannabis business, but at the same time the demand is higher, and it's quite easy to beat a lot of these legal recreational outlets because of all the restrictions they have to face. And obviously the illicit companies do not need to pay the same taxation. They don't need to deal with any of these problems, and they can grow fresher and higher quality product and sell it for cheaper, which obviously consumers would choose, because why wouldn't they? So, I do think that there's a lot of credit to the Canadian Cannabis Council for bringing this up, for trying to create awareness for this, for trying to push that these regulations get changed. But I'm also extremely doubtful of if they'll get changed, if you'll see any sort of meaningful impact, because the government made a lot of money off the cannabis industry. The cannabis companies did not really make any money. And at least when you're looking at the Canadian government right now, I don't think that they're too concerned about if the company succeeds or fails, or if any companies or the industry as a whole succeeds or fails. I think they're just more concerned about how much profit they can rake in at the moment from this industry. And realistically, a lot of the complaints that people have is there is already regular taxation on this industry. So if you are, a $1 billion business, that's still a lot of tax revenue that's coming through. You don't really need to add an extra layer of taxation on top of that to simply burden this industry. Again, tobacco, alcohol, they don't have these same restrictions. They don't have these same tax difficulties. And again, they cause significantly more harm to their consumers, and there's a higher risk potential for addiction and for harm. Whereas with cannabis, it's a medical product realistically that can be used recreationally. It's not the opposite. It's not a recreational product entirely. We can sell it in recreational, but it does have medical benefits. That's how these industries came online to begin with. So the comparison isn't quite fair, and I do think that hopefully some regulators at least are starting to pay attention to the fact that, well, you're going to lose your cash cow. Eventually you're going to collapse this whole industry and turn it into something that needs a lot of repairs and eventually needs government bailouts or funding, unless you deal with this now and actually have more reasonable expectations and also just realize where society is today. We don't have the same stigmas surrounding cannabis. We now know a lot more about the plant, about how it affects us, the risks associated with it. we've seen in lots of markets. There was a few news articles that came out in the last week or so that were talking about how you actually saw underage cannabis consumption go down in states where they had legalized. And a lot of things of that variety have been sort of exposed and proven within the industry, is that all these risks that are supposedly associated with extending cannabis out and normalizing it aren't actually based in reality. And again, this industry is going to continue forward unless it's specifically destroyed by the government, which I don't quite understand the agenda of that in the long term. So, in related news, the Ontario Cannabis Store announced that it will be reducing its price margins in a bid to help pot retailers compete with the illicit market. The OCS estimates the move will put $35 million back into the hands of licensed pot companies, and $60 million in the 2024 fiscal year. Now, the margin reduction will come from a fixed markup from each product category that will be standard for all producers and applied as a percentage above each product's landed costs, which already take into account producers' margins and excise tax. The margin drop was largely triggered by the strength of the illicit park market, which still made up 43% of Ontario's cannabis market last March. This announcement will allow producers to better compete with the illicit market, particularly when it comes to dried flower, said Charlie Bowman, Chief Executive Officer and President of licensed producer Hexo Corp, in an email. Now, the average price of cannabis was $11.78 per gram at the start of 2019, shortly after legalization, but fell to $7.50 per gram in 2021, a November report from Deloitte Canada and cannabis research firms Highfire and BDSA said. Now, the average price for vape cartridges has similarly fallen by 41% from $32 per gram to $19 per gram a year later. So, this is something, again, whether you're looking at Canada, California, or any other state markets, price dropping is something that's dramatically affecting the industry. And I've talked to a few people who have discussed the idea that you kind of have a double attack right now for the cannabis industry, in that you have inflation prices going up, so their cost of operations are going up as these businesses are reliant on other industries, other supply chains, etc. So they're getting hit with higher costs for their operations, but at the same time, the consumer market, as well as competition with the illicit market, is forcing them to drive prices down. So not only they are selling their product for cheaper, but it costs more to make that product. And this is, again, kind of hitting them from both sides. And I do think that this move, at least from the OCS, is a step in the right direction in response to what the Canadian Cannabis Council brought up. And hopefully other provinces will follow suit. Right now, I know Canopy just released an announcement saying that they're debating whether they're going to pass these savings on to the consumer. And I think that for a lot of companies, this will be a difficult decision, is do you offer sort of this savings to the OCS market, or do you just have to sort of take that margin reduction for what it is and use this to keep your company afloat? And again, because so many of these companies, especially companies like large-scale producers, Canopy Growth, are struggling in this market, they've just had a massive amount of layoffs, etc. I could see them easily choosing to just keep their prices as is, to just kind of weather the storm for right now, which you can't really fault them for, because again, they're getting hit from a lot of different angles here. And there's not really a lot of ways for these companies to survive unless they're going to sort of, find some strategies to scrape by. In other news from Canada, Green Party leader Elizabeth May says she wants Canada to consider expanding access to psychedelic drugs as medical treatments. Now, on Tuesday of last week, May and other MPs joined a delegation of patients and healthcare practitioners who are trying to lobby the federal government to make psilocybin, the psychedelic compound produced by magic mushrooms, more readily available. The group is calling on lawmakers to advance clinical trials to better understand how the substance could be used for medical treatment of some mental disorders such as depression and anxiety. We need to do more research, May said at a news conference, but to get that research done, we need to make access available to patients whose doctors are there to help them with registered therapists who know how to administer psilocybin. So, it's always good to see people pushing through this psychedelics. At the same time, it's really hard for me to not find it infuriating that we're always having to hear, we need more research, we need licensed practitioners, licensed therapists, registered therapists who know how to administer psilocybin. When realistically, there's an entire shamanistic culture that's existed for thousands of years within multiple countries of the world that knows exactly what they're doing when it comes to psychedelics. When you're looking at ayahuasca, when you're looking at psilocybin, and when you're looking at really most of these psychedelic compounds, it turns out we do know that these things affect you in a positive way. We do know that there's almost zero risk of addiction because of the very nature of psychedelics. It's a very rare and strange human being who actually will take these drugs in higher concentrations on a continued basis because of the effect of them. When you're having basically 100 hours of therapy condensed into, a 3-hour trip or a 12-hour trip if you're doing acid or ayahuasca, not a lot of people come out of that and go, I'd like another round right away. And most of these drugs give you stomach, discomfort. Most of them will make you throw up at certain dosages. There's nothing dangerous about that. It creates sort of a general cleanse and purge of your gut and your liver. But at the same time, there's not really a lot of reason to be like, I want to do that every day of the week. As well as with psychedelics, almost all of them, except for DMT, have sort of an instant tolerance build in your body, in that if you take psilocybin on day 1, if you try to take it again on day 2, you have to take 10 times the amount. I've talked about this before, so even the very concept of being addicted to these substances is basically impossible. And again, we're not confused about how these work, how they have positive effects, and how to administer them, and different doses and all those things. There's an insanely large culture that's existed for, again, thousands of years. Huge resurgence in the 60s and 70s, and again, a huge resurgence today. I don't find that there really actually is a need for more research or more data or more understanding of this. I find that this is the problem of today's society, is the new religion of science, essentially. We have people today who, very similar in the past, where you would have priests who were reading Latin and the rest of the community couldn't, interpreting data and providing that information to the public, and the public just took their word for it, and they always needed to hear it from that guy. It's very similar to what we have today. There always has to be a new study, new data, new information, and if you actually look into most of these studies, most of them are bullshit, most of them are poorly run, most of them don't have the type of structure that we would actually want. MAPS has done some of the largest scale studies available within the psychedelic space, and somehow those get disregarded. Yet some other random asshole group from one university will come up with a 30 or 50 person study and make a bunch of claims about psychedelics that are completely unfounded, and that's what people pay attention to. So I do find that that conversation really needs to go away from the human zeitgeist altogether, is this lust for new data and new studies. I've read studies that said, new study finds that yoga is good for your brain. People didn't need to do that study. The people who did that study should not have received funding. They should not have received any ability to do that research, because it's fundamentally stupid. People have known anecdotally for, again, thousands of years. We know yoga is good for your body. We don't need to have studies proving why it's good for your body. I mean, that's interesting. If you can learn more about brain chemistry, it is interesting. Some of the stuff with psychedelic research is interesting. Again, Graham Hancock has talked about a group in the UK that's working on actually keeping people under longer in the DMT space to better navigate basically the psychedelic landscape. I'm on board with that type of research and that type of studies. But saying, like, we don't know if this is going to benefit you, we don't know how to take this safely, we don't know what the risks and the benefits are and how they weigh out, we absolutely do. We know that there's essentially no possibility of overdosing on all of these substances. Which compared to every single other medication that's on the market today, when you're looking at pharmaceutical products, should just make it a no-brainer. When you consider that, okay, well, what did we do with SSRIs for depression? It turns out that was a terrible idea, and it actually did more harm than good. And that all of the data in that entire situation was manipulated, if not outright falsified. That's what you get from this sort of data worship ideology, is you can have tons of manipulation all over the place. I'm not going to go into huge details, but obviously there's the same type of conversation that's being exposed right now when you're looking at vaccines, when you're looking at large-scale pharmaceutical companies. This is what they've done forever. There's no one in the cannabis space or the psychedelic space today who is unaware of how data can be manipulated, how you can use data to basically prove a point that doesn't exist. So this idea that we need more research, more data, more understanding is just completely, baseless. To me, it delegitimizes the argument around psychedelics. I would much prefer that, a person like Elizabeth May just came forward with thousands of hours of testimonial, which already exist. You don't need more than that. There are literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of patients around the world who have been exposed to these products, who have created lifelong benefits from a single exposure and extremely positive results from continued exposure in therapeutic or, again, shamanistic settings. And we're not considering that there is, again, an entire shamanistic, basically a religious culture out there that has worshipped and understood these drugs for thousands of years. So I would have much more appreciated if someone like Elizabeth May or any of these regulators or politicians who are trying to push forward the psychedelic agenda would have the balls to bring basically, patient testimony forward and say, look at this. Like, we can't ignore this. This is soldiers. This is people with PTSD. This is people with depression. This is terminally ill patients. This is people with a variety of, both physical and mental ailments that are getting cured from these drugs whenever they have access to them. And to deny that is just insane. And to say, well, we need more research. We need more understanding. If this were any other pharmaceutical drug, people would be losing their mind about how amazing it is. If this was a product that Pfizer or Johnson & Johnson released, everyone would be saying this is the most genius breakthrough that's ever existed. But because it has all this weird stigma attached to it, and because people just refuse to want to admit openly that they were just outright wrong in criminalizing these drugs. That's the biggest issue I find, is we don't want to get to a point where we say, we fucked up. That was a big fucking mistake. Criminalizing cannabis, criminalizing psychedelics, that was a huge fuck up, and now we need to undo that error. People did that with alcohol. They realized that was a big fuck up, and alcohol is ubiquitous with social culture today. It is the social lube of the human mind in today's world. Cannabis and psychedelics could be a competition for that, and I think an extremely beneficial one, but it needs to get to a point where people say, we've been fundamentally stupid in trying to criminalize drugs that are absolutely beneficial to us, that have almost a zero chance of an overdose or adverse event. Again, there is psychotic events that can be associated with psychedelics and cannabis, but even that is somewhat anecdotal and hasn't really been proven in any data set or research, because the same amount of psychotic events happen whether you've been exposed to these drugs or not. It turns out that some people lose their minds in society no matter what happens. But also the irony is the main cure for a lot of these psychotic episodes is these drugs. So a person who loses their mind on cannabis could also be cured from their sort of insanity from psilocybin exposure, or even from cannabis again. It's a lot of the set and setting. It's a lot of how you dose this person. It's a lot of which specific products you give them, because there's a million different strains of mushrooms that are psychedelic, and there's a million different strains of cannabis. It turns out, just like with other products on the, whether you're looking at tomatoes or anything, some people react differently to certain things. But, again, it's heading in the right direction, but I wish that there would be more people within the political space and the regulation space who would, again, have the balls to just openly admit that this is a huge fucking mistake that we need to immediately fix if we're going to dramatically improve the life and health of, basically this entire planet. Lastly, in relation to that news, Lucy Scientific Discovery Incorporated, trading on the NASDAQ as LSDI, announced last week that it's filed an amendment to its current dealer's license with Health Canada to add cocaine and heroin, among others, to the list of approved substances that is authorized to manufacture. The shift forward for public health response to the drug crisis will provide greater opportunities for people who use substances to connect with a growing range of harm reduction and treatment options. Currently, Lucy focuses on the development of psychedelic drugs for research purposes and hopes to supply safe access programs in the future. The company has licenses to manufacture several controlled substances, including psilocybin, MDMA, LSD, psilocin, NNTMT, mescaline, and 2CB. We look forward to a time when Lucy can safely supply harm reduction programs globally, aiming to reduce lethal and or negative consequences associated with adulterated drug supply, particularly considering that fentanyl overdose is the leading cause of deaths among 18 to 45-year-olds in the U.S., said Chris McEvery, the company's CEO. It's time to realize that the failed war on drugs that's caused additional harm to the masses worldwide and harm reduction programs will lead to less death and more treatment options in the long term. So I would definitely recommend, if you're interested in psychedelic companies right now. Lucy Scientific Discovery just had a great IPO and is rung the NASDAQ bell last week. They do seem like they'll be definitely an interesting company to keep track of as psychedelics move forward. And again, you hear this a lot from people within the industry, is that this is an obvious thing, that if we're going to actually deal with real problems, which is fentanyl overdoses, which came from the pharma industry, surprise. So that's a legal drug that was brought into the market and is now killing the most people. But these illegal drugs that could actually help a lot of people with a ton of issues in their life are the ones that we need more data on, more science on. Fentanyl was manipulated from day one. Multiple companies manipulated the shit out of the data with that. The opioid crisis. Tons of manipulation, tons of bribery. Companies were sued. Didn't really affect their profit margins at all. But the reality is that is the alternative, is if we go this data route, we're always going to be getting hosed by large-scale pharmaceutical companies who understand that the average person is incapable of looking through these data sets, looking through these studies, and actually analyzing what the fuck's going on. There's been a huge debate, obviously, in our world today, with tons of scientists arguing amongst each other, tons of doctors arguing over data sets, arguing over studies and the effectiveness of them, how they're done, if they were actually conclusive, or if it was just a bunch of bullshit. And when you use tons of technical jargon and you start talking about specific receptors in the brain and you start talking about specific chemical profiles, the average person isn't going to be able to keep up. And that jargon keeps these companies safe from the vast majority of lawmakers and regulators, because they don't understand it, so they rely on the FDA or Health Canada, and those organizations, it turns out, are heavily funded by the very companies that are trying to push these drugs through. So I find if we really want to get psychedelics out there, the conversation around we need more research and we need more data needs to go away, and it needs to be pushed more into a direction of, if you're not an idiot, you should be on board with this. And I think it needs to be that aggressive, of to call out current politicians and lawmakers as being exposed as morons for not undoing stupid action of the past. It's not like any of the current politicians in the world were the ones who actually implemented drug policies. I guess Joe Biden would be somewhat of an example of that. He did actually have some influence on certain drug policies in the U.S. That being said, though, the average politician or regulator hasn't been around for 60 plus years. They weren't involved with criminalizing these products in the first place. So it seems to me it's just an obvious move for them to be pushing forward with decriminalization quickly and legal outlets almost immediately, because again, the risks associated are almost zero and the benefits are extremely massive for the society and just people as a whole. So hopefully it gets there, but it is goddamn frustrating to hear these people have this same conversation over and over again. And the reality is whether you're looking at cannabis or psychedelics, if you think that there's not enough data and research out there, you haven't been looking. There is just endless amounts of customer testimonial, of patient testimonial, of data sets, of long-term research studies that are all over the planet. And if we're going to ignore all of those, and it can only come from one specific outlet who's the data master, then it just doesn't fucking matter. Anyways, that's all for today's podcast. Enjoy the rest of your day. That's all for today's podcast. Podcast is now a certified word trademark on the blockchain through Cognate Incorporated CM certification. InvestorIdeas.com podcasts are also available on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play Music, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and TuneIn. If you'd like to be a guest or sponsor of this podcast, please contact InvestorIdeas.com. Investor Ideas reminds all listeners to read our disclaimers and disclosures on the InvestorIdeas.com website, and this podcast is not an endorsement to buy products or services or securities. Investors are reminded that all investments involve risk and possible loss of investment. Investor Ideas does not condone the use of cannabis except where permissible by law. Our site does not possess, distribute, or sell cannabis products.